In the early 1600s, the world's understanding of the universe was simple and absolute. The Earth stood still at the center, while the sun, moon, planets, and stars revolved around it. This belief wasn't just science, it was tied to religion, culture, and power. Questioning it was like questioning the very order of creation. And yet, in a small Italian city, a man named Galileo Galilei began to see things differently. Armed with a telescope of his own design, he explored the skies with unmatched precision. His discoveries were groundbreaking: moons orbiting distant planets, phases of Venus that made no sense in the old model, and a moon scarred with mountains and craters instead of being a perfect sphere. But instead of being celebrated, he was tried, humiliated, and confined for the rest of his life. These were more than just observations. They were challenges to centuries of accepted truth. And in a time when the church held immense authority over knowledge, such challenges were dangerous. Galileo's passion for truth would bring him into direct conflict with the most powerful institution of his age, and ultimately, it would cost him his freedom. Today, we're uncovering why this brilliant mind was silenced, and how his fight for truth changed the world forever. Galileo Galilei was born on February 15, 1564, in the city of Pisa, Italy, the same city famous for its Leaning Tower. He grew up during the height of the Renaissance, a time of art, invention, and scientific curiosity. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and mathematician, and though the family wasn't wealthy, they valued education and creative thinking. From a young age, Galileo showed a fascination with how the world worked. At first, his interests leaned towards mathematics and mechanics, the way objects moved, how they fell, and why they behaved as they did. The stars and planets were always there in the background, but it wasn't until his late 20s that his interest in astronomy began to truly grow. But in 1609, when he was 45 years old, everything changed. That year, word spread through Europe of a remarkable Dutch invention, a simple tube with lenses that could make faraway objects appear closer. Galileo immediately understood the potential, but instead of simply copying it, he wanted to master it. He began studying the principles of lenses, how convex and concave glass could bend light, how the curvature of a lens could magnify or shrink an image. He experimented with different shapes and thicknesses of glass, learning how even the smallest imperfection could blur the view. It wasn't just assembly, it was craftsmanship. Galileo ground and polished each lens by hand, carefully setting them into wooden tubes, testing them against distant rooftops and church towers. His first attempt could magnify objects 3 times, his second 8 times. And then, after weeks of refinement, he built a telescope that could magnify up to 20 times, the most powerful on Earth at that moment. For the first time, Galileo turned his creation toward the night sky. The moon was not the smooth, perfect sphere described in ancient texts. It was rugged, scarred with mountains and valleys. The planets were not wandering points of light. Some had moons of their own, and the stars. They were not a few scattered jewels, but countless suns, stretching far beyond human imagination. It was in these nights that Galileo's quiet fascination became an unshakable mission. The telescope had not only brought the heavens closer, it had brought him to the edge of a truth that would shake the world. As Galileo continued his nightly observations, he recorded everything: detailed sketches of the moon's surface, the strange orbits of Jupiter's 4 largest moons, and the changing phases of Venus. Each drawing told the same story. The universe was not as the ancient philosophers or the church described. For over 1,000 years, the dominant belief was the geocentric model. Earth at the center, everything else moving around it. This wasn't just a scientific view, it was tied directly to religious doctrine. The sun, they believed, was placed in the heavens to light the earth, and the fixed stars were the outer boundary of God's creation. But Galileo's discoveries painted a different picture, one that matched the heliocentric model proposed by Nicolaus Copernicus decades earlier. In this view, the sun, not the earth, was at the center of the solar system. It was a theory the church had already labeled foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical because it appeared to contradict the Bible. Galileo knew this, yet he couldn't keep quiet. He shared his findings with scholars, nobles, and even church leaders, demonstrating the telescope's power. Some were amazed, but others were deeply unsettled. If the Earth was not the center, then humanity's place in creation was not what Scripture seemed to say. And that was dangerous territory. By 1616, the whispers of Galileo's work had grown into public debate. Word reached the highest levels of the Catholic Church. The reaction was swift. Galileo was summoned and given an official order: do not teach, discuss, or defend the heliocentric theory in any way. It was not an arrest, but it was a clear warning. One that told Galileo the truth he saw in the night sky had the power to threaten more than just old science. It could challenge the very authority of the Church itself. After 1616, Galileo remained under watch. The order was clear. He could not teach or defend the idea that the sun was at the center, so for years he shifted his focus, writing on mechanics, tides, and engineering, always careful to avoid directly challenging the Church's stance on astronomy. But Galileo was not a man who could let go of the truth. He stayed in quiet contact with scholars who supported the heliocentric model, collecting new evidence and refining his arguments. Then, in 1623, something happened that gave Galileo hope. A new pope was elected, Urban VIII, a man who had once admired Galileo's work. Urban VIII even invited Galileo to Rome for discussions and seemed open to scientific debate. To Galileo, this felt like an opportunity. Perhaps the climate had softened, and maybe, just maybe, he could speak more openly. For years, Galileo worked on a new manuscript. It would present the two competing systems of the universe, the old Ptolemaic model, with Earth at the center, and the newer Copernican model with the sun at the center. But Galileo thought he had found a safe way to do it. He framed the book as a dialogue between three characters. One argued for the geocentric view, one for the heliocentric, and one played the role of an open-minded listener. Galileo believed that if he simply presented both sides without openly declaring a winner, he could avoid accusations of heresy. In 1632, his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, was published. It was immediately popular, filled with clever arguments and clear explanations that favoured the heliocentric model without outright stating it. But there was a problem. The character defending the geocentric model came across as slow-witted and foolish, and his arguments sounded suspiciously like those Pope Urban VIII had once used in conversation with Galileo. Word got back to the Pope, and he felt mocked. What Galileo had intended as a careful, balanced discussion was now seen as a public insult, and worse, as direct defiance of the Church's order from 1616. The goodwill he thought he had was gone, and the stage was set for the trial that would define the rest of his life. In 1633, less than a year after his book was published, Galileo was summoned to Rome. The summons was not an invitation, it was an order from the Roman Inquisition, the Church's powerful court that investigated heresy. The journey itself was dangerous for an elderly man of nearly 70, already suffering from poor health. But the greater danger awaited him in the city, a trial where the outcome could mean imprisonment, or worse. When Galileo arrived, he was placed under house guard and interrogated for weeks. The atmosphere inside the Inquisition's chambers was intimidating. Tall ceilings, shadowed corners, and rows of stern-faced cardinals and theologians. These men weren't merely scholars, they were the guardians of the Church's authority, and they had absolute power over his fate. The charges were clear, that Galileo had violated the 1616 order by teaching and defending heliocentrism, that he had misled Church censors in order to get his dialogue published. At first, Galileo defended himself, insisting that he had only presented a balanced discussion of both models. But the Inquisition had records, witnesses, and most importantly, the Pope's personal anger. They accused him not just of disobedience, but of betraying the Church's trust. As the questioning intensified, so did the pressure. He was reminded, subtly but unmistakably, of what had happened to others who refused to yield. The shadow of torture hung over the proceedings, even if it was never carried out. In the end, Galileo gave in. Kneeling before the court, he read aloud a prepared statement, formally recanting his belief in the heliocentric model. He declared, in the Church's words, that the Earth was immovable at the centre of the universe. But legend says that as he rose to his feet, he muttered under his breath, "Et pour se mouve," which meant, "and yet it moves." Whether he said it or not, history remembers the moment as a quiet act of defiance in the face of overwhelming power. After his trial in 1633, Galileo was not sent to a dungeon. Instead, he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. It may sound merciful, but for a man whose work depended on sharing ideas, it was a slow and painful kind of imprisonment. He was confined to his villa in Arcetri, near Florence. No lectures, no public debates. Every letter he sent was monitored. Every visitor was noted. Yet even in this isolation, Galileo's mind never stopped working. He continued to write in secret, focusing on the laws of motion and mechanics, ideas that would later inspire Isaac Newton. His eyesight began to fail, and by the last years of his life, he was completely blind. Still, with the help of his students and friends, he dictated his thoughts and discoveries, refusing to let silence erase his work. On January 8, 1642, Galileo died quietly in his home. He was still officially a prisoner of the church, his name tarnished in their records. But history would prove him right. The heliocentric model became the foundation of modern astronomy, and Galileo himself became known as the father of modern science. Today, his story stands as a reminder that truth can be delayed but not defeated, that even when authority tries to contain it, knowledge finds a way to escape. Because no matter what they said, the earth still moves.